What if a brutal shift in climate, the kind that could erase entire landscapes overnight, carried a hidden message meant to awaken something deep inside our earliest ancestors? Imagine standing 2.2 million years ago in a world where the sky was not a symbol of hope, but a constant threat, where every gust of wind, every sudden drop in temperature, every crackle in the distant horizon could mark the difference between survival and disappearance. This was not just a physical battle against nature. It was an emotional and spiritual confrontation that shaped the very first intuitions of humanity. When the climate turned violent, the first humans did not have language, tools, or structures to make sense of it. All they had were their senses, their instincts, and a growing awareness that the world was far more mysterious than they could grasp. These early hominins lived in a constant state of alert, reading the ground, the air, the shifting patterns of light as if they were signals from an unseen realm. It was in this raw and unforgiving environment that the roots of spiritual perception were born. Climate was not just climate, it was a force that whispered warnings, pushed them to move, to adapt, to trust impulses they could not explain. Picture a night when the temperature dropped so abruptly that silence itself felt like a threat. The group huddled together, their breaths turning into thin clouds, while an elder sensed something approaching long before it arrived. Not because they could see it, but because climate extremes trained them to listen to the invisible. These moments forged a kind of ancestral wisdom, a primitive spiritual radar that helped them survive the unknown. And whether they understood it or not, every decision shaped by fear, intuition, or sudden insight was a spiritual response crafted by the brutal world around them. You have probably felt something similar in your own life, that inexplicable sense that the world is trying to tell you something, even when nothing obvious is happening. This connection between instinct and meaning traces directly back to those ancient humans navigating a world on the edge. Understanding how they interpreted these silent warnings helps us understand why we still feel certain fears, intuitions, and impulses today. And before we move deeper into this journey, tell me, have you ever experienced a moment when the environment felt like it was speaking directly to you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like to support this exploration, and make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next layers of this ancient story. Now let us follow this thread of ancestral perception as it begins to unfold, carrying us into the hidden landscapes of their spiritual world. That ancestral sensitivity, awakened by violent shifts in the environment, began to evolve beyond simple reaction. It became a kind of listening, a deep attunement to the invisible tension between sky and soil, between silence and storm. These early humans, still nameless in history, began decoding a new dimension of reality, not through logic, but through repeated confrontation with nature's fury. They did not yet have the words to describe what they sensed, but their bodies remembered patterns. Their bones carried the echoes of past winters, their skin responded to subtle air changes, and their minds began linking emotion with natural signs. When a sudden drop in temperature swept across the landscape, it wasn't perceived as random cold. It was a message, not in language, but in sensation. A message carved into their flesh by repetition and survival. They began noticing that before the cold came, birds disappeared. Before the rains collapsed their shelters, ants relocated their paths. These fragments of observation became survival maps etched in instinct, and from those maps emerged something even more primal: meaning, not yet spirituality in the modern sense, but a proto-symbolism where patterns meant more than just patterns. They meant intention, even will. In the fierce wildness of climate extremes, the landscape didn't just change physically, it transformed emotionally. A clearing struck by lightning became more than just burnt land. It became a boundary, a place marked, a place where something had spoken through fire. Over time, these markings began to accumulate. Places were no longer neutral. They became loaded with memory and emotion. The terrain was emotionalized. The past lived in the rocks, the wind, the water, and each human moving through this world carried their own interpretations of what it all meant. What we see emerging is not mythology, not yet, but a raw, unspoken dialogue between early human consciousness and the overwhelming power of the earth. And every climate event acted as a teacher. A violent sandstorm didn't just threaten them, it taught them to predict, to relocate, to reassess. These teachings, harsh, unpredictable, unforgiving, slowly rewired their nervous systems. The climate was not a backdrop. It was an active force, sculpting behavior, shaping cognition, forging emotional intelligence where language had not yet arrived. The more unpredictable the environment became, the deeper the human connection to it grew. They no longer simply adapted. They began anticipating. Their bodies responded before the danger became visible. A quiet stillness in the air might trigger sudden movement. A strange chill in the night could mean retreat. These reactions were not taught. They were absorbed, internalized, passed not through stories, but through repetition and visceral memory. And as these survival instincts deepened, so too did the belief, however unformed, that something beyond their comprehension was whispering to them through the climate itself. As this unspoken dialogue with the environment deepened, a new layer of perception began forming within those early humans. Patterns were no longer experienced only as warnings or signs of danger. They slowly became part of an emerging emotional structure, shaping the foundations of what we would later recognize as ritual, belief, and spiritual interpretation. When the climate shifted dramatically, when scorching heat fractured the earth or roaring winds stripped entire sections of the landscape, the experience imprinted itself on the group in a way that transcended survival. These natural forces felt intentional, almost directed, as if the world itself was expressing moods that humans had to respect, decode, and respond to. In moments when harsh winds tore through their camps, the group would instinctively press together, anchoring themselves not only physically, but emotionally. These collective responses gave birth to a sense of shared meaning. A violent storm wasn't simply a meteorological event. It became a moment of unity, fear, reflection, and sometimes reverence. Over time, these recurring climate episodes created a rhythm, a cycle of tension and release, destruction and renewal. This rhythm carved deep impressions into their minds, convincing them that nature operated according to a kind of logic, even if they could not fully understand it. As generations passed, these impressions solidified into early behavioral patterns that resembled rituals. When dark clouds formed, some individuals might touch the ground before seeking shelter, mimicking gestures learned unconsciously from previous generations. Others might repeat sounds or breaths that helped them remain calm, patterns passed down not through speech, but through observation and instinct. These simple acts, repeated over thousands of years, eventually gained symbolic weight. What began as survival responses gradually evolved into expressions of meaning, primitive rituals shaped by climate itself. The harshness of the environment also created emotional associations that would later become the backbone of early spiritual thought. A sudden drought brought fear not just because water vanished, but because it disrupted the perceived order of the world. A heavy rainfall after weeks of dryness wasn't just relief. It felt like restoration, forgiveness, or balance returning. These emotional interpretations embedded themselves into the collective memory of each group, strengthening the sense that the climate was more than a physical force. It was a presence that reacted, responded, punished, or granted. Even without language, They felt that certain places held different energies. A valley repeatedly struck by cold winds became a place of caution. A cave that remained temperate during brutal seasons became sacred in its own way. The climate sculpted meaning through repetition, and human perception shaped that meaning into early frameworks of spiritual behavior. These small rituals, instinctive associations, and collective emotional reactions were the seeds of something far greater. Under the pressure of constant environmental uncertainty, the first threads of spirituality began to weave themselves quietly through the daily lives of our ancestors, preparing the ground for even deeper forms of interpretation that would soon emerge. The emotional responses triggered by these climatic rituals did more than just help early humans survive. They began to create internal narratives, shaping how they saw themselves in relation to the world. When the sky darkened or the winds screamed across empty plains, it wasn't just the body that reacted, it was something deeper. Rising tension in the chest, a strange stillness in the limbs, a sharpened awareness just before disaster struck. These reactions became so familiar, so consistent, that they were no longer seen as random. They were interpreted as signals, internal alerts stirred by something greater than themselves. Fear was no longer just instinct, it was information. It pointed to patterns, and those patterns over time gave birth to a spiritual intuition rooted not in doctrine, but in felt experience. The eye, feeling that something was wrong before it was visible. The chill that crept in just before the storm broke. The silence before animals fled. These subtle cues formed the early scaffolding of what would become belief. An idea that the world wasn't just reacting randomly, but communicating through sensation and rhythm. It's easy to underestimate how powerful these sensations were in shaping early behavior. A slight unease could prevent a fatal decision. A sharp instinct to move could spare an entire group. And the more these moments proved true, the more they were trusted. People began to lean into that invisible pull, to honor the emotion itself as a guide. This is where the roots of spiritual awareness intertwined with survival, not through myth, not yet through language, but through consistent, lived experience. When the climate turned violent and predictable paths became dangerous, this instinctive guidance took center stage. Some individuals, perhaps more sensitive, more aware, began to be seen differently. Their ability to detect shifts in the air, changes in tone, or silence in the trees gave them an almost mystical aura. But in truth, it was a sensitivity forged by necessity, carved by fear, and sharpened through ancestral memory. These proto-guides didn't perform ceremonies or offer explanations. They acted, they warned, they felt, and others followed. This constant interaction between fear and meaning slowly etched itself into their identities. Who you were, how you responded, and what you sensed became part of your role in the group. The lines between emotion, intuition, and environment blurred. A low hum in the chest before a storm wasn't ignored. It was honored. And in honoring that signal, early humans began to believe that something within them was responding to something beyond them. A hidden intelligence, perhaps. A voice from the invisible. As these inner signals became more trusted, the relationship between early humans and their emotional responses to the climate evolved into something even more intimate. The environment didn't just shape how they moved or when they hid. It began to influence how they felt about each other, about themselves, about existence. Scarcity, in particular, brought this into sharp focus. When food vanished, when water sources dried out, when the cold lasted longer than it should have, something new stirred inside them. It wasn't just physical desperation. It was emotional disorientation, a quiet, unraveling of certainty. And in that space of uncertainty, the need to find meaning became more urgent. They started to search for more than just shelter or warmth. They began to search for understanding. In times of harsh climate stress, group cohesion became essential. The emotional weight of the unknown pressed them closer together, not just physically, but spiritually. They shared feelings they couldn't name: tension, dread, flickers of hope. And through that shared emotional experience, an invisible thread was spun, one that held them together with something deeper than instinct. When the earth gave nothing, and when the sky took too much, the first humans didn't just wait. They responded with action, yes, but also with reflection. You can imagine them staring into a flickering fire, watching the embers fall like distant stars, asking no one in particular why the world had changed and what they were supposed to learn from it. These were not thoughts formed in words, but in sensations, in shared glances, in breath held in silence. The emotional fabric of these moments left marks on the soul. In those fragile, desperate seasons, something profound happened. They began to believe that suffering itself was a passage, not just a punishment. That endurance carried meaning. That surviving wasn't just winning against nature, it was aligning with something bigger, something invisible. And that alignment required not only action, but a kind of inner adjustment. A mental stillness. A surrender to the moment that felt strangely like reverence. Even the way they touched each other changed. In climates where warmth was scarce, the act of sharing body heat became sacred. A gesture of survival, yes, but also of connection. The cold became the teacher, and human contact became the lesson. These moments laid the foundation for what would one day be called spiritual community, not built around ideas or gods, but around shared endurance, shared emotion, and the unspoken sense that they were being shaped by something they could feel but never fully see. Through repetition, these emotional responses and survival mechanisms began to form rituals of their own, not ceremonies with structure, but patterns with meaning. Where to sleep when the wind changed direction. How to walk in silence when the sky felt wrong. When to pause and listen to what couldn't be heard. These were not habits. They were inherited sensitivities, molded by climate and polished by time, slowly transforming survival into something sacred. As these inherited sensitivities deepened, early humans began noticing that certain elements of the natural world carried patterns too consistent to ignore. Not every message came from storms or temperature shifts. Some came from details so subtle that only repeated exposure to hardship could have sharpened their awareness enough to perceive them. A single tree that remained standing after violent winds, a rock whose temperature shifted moments. Before a weather change, a stream that clouded unexpectedly even when the skies were clear. These anomalies began to feel like more than coincidences. They became markers, silent messengers in a world where everything mattered. Observing these elements was not passive. It required a kind of attention shaped by necessity. Their eyes followed shadows that stretched differently across the ground. Their hands learned to read textures in the soil that hinted at deeper changes beneath the surface. Even the behavior of small creatures, birds, insects, rodents, became part of this growing code of survival. Over countless seasons of threat and scarcity, they learned that nature gave warnings long before danger truly arrived. And what began as practical observation slowly evolved into symbolic interpretation. There were moments when the group paused, not because they saw danger, but because someone felt a shift in the environment that wasn't visible. A drop in the air's tone, a strange vibration carried through the earth. A pattern in the way light moved across distant hills. These observations were woven together, creating a mosaic of meaning that blurred the line between physical reality and spiritual insight. Certain places became known for their quiet messages, a hill that always predicted storms, a cluster of stones that seemed to hum with tension before predators approached. These spaces weren't worshipped, but they were respected, treated with a caution that bordered on reverence. As individuals began recognizing these recurring signs, some people became better interpreters of them. Not because they were chosen or gifted, but because the patterns spoke to them more clearly. They noticed what others missed. They connected sensations with outcomes. They sensed danger before it materialized. These individuals, unknowingly, became the first vessels of spiritual authority, not through power, but through perception. Their guidance didn't come from myth, but from a lifetime of listening to the world in its rawest form. The climate taught them that survival hinged not only on action, but on interpretation. A fallen branch might reveal the direction of a dangerous shift in wind. A cluster of warm stones could signal underground movement triggered by temperature fluctuations, and in each of these encounters, early humans felt the presence of something guiding them, not a deity, but a force that communicated through subtlety. Nature became their silent instructor, nudging them, warning them, challenging them to evolve their awareness. Through these interactions, the belief that the world was layered with meaning grew stronger. Their environment was not random. It was attentive, reactive, deeply intertwined with their existence. Each clue offered by the land felt like an invitation to understand more, to sense deeper, to merge their inner intuition with the outer world. And as these patterns continued to reveal themselves, the spiritual identity of early humans began to take on clearer shapes, unfolding through every whisper of wind, every shifting stone, every flicker of change that hinted at truths still forming in the darkness of deep time. As these natural messengers became woven into the fabric of daily survival, certain individuals within the group began to stand out, not by choice and not through any formal role, but through an unusual sensitivity to the invisible patterns shaping their world. They were the ones who paused a moment longer when the wind shifted, who noticed the tremor beneath the soil before others felt it, who could sense the tension in the air long before a storm revealed itself. These people became, without knowing it, the earliest interpreters of the unseen, the first carriers of what would one day evolve into spiritual guidance. Their insight didn't come from authority or ritual. It emerged from observation, intuition, and a nervous system sharpened by constant exposure to danger. They felt the world differently. A ripple in the grass meant more to them than movement. It was part of a larger pattern. A sudden silence among animals wasn't just quiet. It was an alert. And because their instincts more often proved correct, the group began to look toward them in moments of uncertainty. Not for explanations, because language was still forming, but for direction, for a sense of where safety might be hiding. You can imagine how this reverence began subtly. A glance exchanged before relocating. Camp. A gesture signaling danger. A shared look during a moment of hesitation. Over time, these behaviors took on emotional weight. When these sensitive individuals reacted, others reacted with them. When they grew uneasy, the group shifted its posture. Their presence carried reassurance, not because they were leaders, but because they embodied a connection to something the rest could feel, but not name. Environmental pressure amplified these dynamics. During brutal climate phases, when wind, patterns changed unpredictably, or when the ground cracked under the sun's relentless heat, these proto-guides became anchors in the chaos. Their bodies responded to the environment almost like instruments tuned to frequencies others could not perceive. Their breathing changed before the danger was visible. Their eyes fixed on distant shapes no one else noticed. And this heightened awareness, born from experience, survival, and emotional attunement, gave the impression that something beyond them spoke through their senses. In truth, they were not intermediaries of a supernatural world. They were products of nature's relentless shaping, human beings whose sensitivity had been molded by hardship into a form of perception that felt spiritual long before the concept existed. Their instincts were powerful enough to alter group behavior, and their subtle signals created social patterns that would eventually evolve into formal roles, the seeds of shamans, guides, interpreters of meaning. But in these early ages, the interaction was simple, raw, instinctive. A look, a gesture, a tremor in the body that said, "Move." And as the group followed these subtle prompts, the idea began to form that some people were touched by something deeper, something invisible that guided them through the violent, unpredictable world. As these intuitive individuals subtly shaped group behavior, something else began to emerge. An early form of practical spirituality woven directly into the necessities of survival. Life in a volatile climate did not allow room for elaborate beliefs or structured rituals. Everything had to serve a purpose. Every gesture, every habit, every silence had to contribute to the group's ability to endure. And slowly, without intention, early humans began to fuse meaning with utility, creating a worldview where the spiritual and the practical were indistinguishable. During periods when the climate shifted violently, they learned that survival depended on reading the land with precision. The angle of shadows at dusk guided their movement. The density of fog in the morning told them how far predators might roam. Even the taste of the wind held clues. Dry winds hinted at scarcity ahead, while humid winds signaled hidden water sources. What might seem mystical today was, for them, a language learned through repetition and necessity. Their entire worldview revolved around responding to these cues with absolute presence, as if the land itself dictated the rhythm of their lives. This responsiveness eventually created patterns that felt more than instinctual. Before entering a cave, they paused, not out of superstition, but because countless experiences had taught them that the first breath inside a shelter revealed whether it was safe. The temperature of the air, the scent carried inside, the echo of a footstep, all became indicators of unseen truths. These small, habitual pauses slowly carried emotional weight, and emotional weight became meaning. What started as a safety check subtly transformed into something ritualistic, a moment of connection between themselves and the unseen forces shaping their world. Cooperation also took on a sacred quality. Climate extremes demanded unity. Sharing food during scarcity became more than kindness. It became a binding act, a reinforcement that survival was not an individual pursuit. The harsh environment sculpted a sense of collective purpose that felt spiritual because it transcended simple instinct. Those moments of mutual support, when the fire burned low and the wind howled outside their shelters, they felt a thread connecting them not only to each other, but to something larger, something that watched and responded through the unpredictable movements of the earth and sky. As their sensitivity deepened, even ordinary tasks acquired layers of meaning. Tracking animals was no longer merely functional. It felt like participating in a cycle directed by forces beyond their understanding. Finding water became an act of listening. Seeking shelter became an act of reading the world's intentions. Each action was shaped by memory, intuition, and emotional resonance, creating a way of life where spirituality wasn't a separate domain, but the natural extension of survival. And although they did not yet conceptualize these experiences as belief or religion, a subtle shift had taken place. The world was no longer just environment. It was a partner in an unspoken exchange, responding, guiding, and shaping their path. Through constant negotiation with the forces around them, early humans developed a spiritual framework rooted entirely in the raw, immediate reality of climate, danger, and instinct. A framework that would soon deepen even further as their perception of meaning evolved. The imprint left by those distant climate crises did not vanish when the storms passed or the droughts ended. They remained, not just in memory, but in the bodies and minds of those who had endured. These early humans, exposed repeatedly to uncertainty and danger, began to carry within them emotional patterns shaped by generations of confrontation with the unpredictable. And long after specific storms or seasons had faded, the internal echoes persisted, a tension in the muscles when the air grew too still, a racing heart at the sight of clouds thickening on the horizon, reactions that outlasted the danger, carried forward by memory's unseen weight. These weren't just remnants of fear. They were encoded lessons, emotional fossils buried deep inside the psyche, passed silently from one generation to the next, not through language, but through behavior, through instinct, through shared responses to invisible triggers. When a child startled at a shadow across the cave wall, it wasn't only their own fear. It was the inheritance of 1,000 nights when that same shadow preceded disaster. The past lived on in reflexes, in gut feelings, in a cautious glance cast toward the sky, without knowing why. Over time, these psychological imprints evolved into something more complex. The mind sought meaning in the emotional responses that seemed to arise without warning, a sense of dread before a journey, a sudden anxiety in a familiar place, a persistent unease even when all seemed calm. These sensations demanded explanation. And in seeking that explanation, early humans reached back into the only source of truth they knew, the memory of the Earth's volatility. They began to suspect that these feelings weren't random, that perhaps they were messages, not from the outside world anymore, but from something within, a deep ancestral voice warning, guiding, remembering. This is how ancient emotional patterns began to shape the architecture of belief. The fear passed down through generations became more than a survival mechanism. It became a compass. And as the human brain grew more capable of abstract thought, it began to imagine sources for those inner messages, spirits, forces, presences. The invisible world they once read in the sky was now mirrored in the invisible world within them. Climate no longer needed to shout through storms. It had already spoken. Its messages had been absorbed, internalized, transformed into emotional echoes that guided thought and behavior even in the absence of danger. Modern humans still carry these echoes. The urge to pause before crossing a silent field, the chill down the spine in an empty room, the inexplicable certainty that something is about to change. These sensations are not new. They are ancient residues of a time when the environment demanded total awareness. They are shadows of a world where survival and spiritual meaning were one and the same. And though the language around us has changed, the emotional architecture remains. A quiet, persistent memory of an earth that once whispered through ice and fire, carving warnings into the minds of those who dared to listen. And yet, even as these early humans adapted, interpreted, and survived, something deeper was crystallizing inside them, something that would outlive the changing skies and burning heat. Beneath the practical responses to a brutal climate, a quiet transformation had begun. They were no longer just reacting to nature, they were forming relationships with it. The wind was no longer just air, it was a signal. The earth wasn't just ground, it was a memory. Every tree, stone, animal track, and breath in the air held meaning. Meaning that wasn't always explainable, but was undeniably felt. Meaning that demanded presence, attention, and reverence. And through that reverence, a kind of wisdom emerged. Not in words, not in doctrine, but in sensation. In the way they moved differently through certain spaces. In the way they waited before acting, even when no threat was visible. In the way they trusted the invisible long before they understood it. They began to live not just in response to the environment, but in dialogue with it. This dialogue shaped their identity. They were no longer just creatures of the land. They were part of it. Every choice, Every instinct, every act of survival echoed with something sacred. This was the true birth of spiritual perception, not bound by temples or myths, but etched into their nervous systems by a world that never stopped testing them. It was a spirituality born of cold nights and scorching days, of silence so deep it taught them to listen, and of dangers so unpredictable it forced them to trust what could not be seen. The climate did not just shape their bodies, it forged their minds. It carved their emotional landscapes, and it handed them a legacy of awareness so profound that we still carry traces of it in the way we respond to the unknown. Today, when you feel a tension in your chest without reason, when a sudden stillness makes you pause, when your body reacts before your thoughts can catch up, you are touching that legacy. A legacy not built in comfort, but in fire, ice, and dust. A legacy that whispers through the noise of modern life, reminding you that deep down, you were shaped by forces that required not just strength, but perception. The first humans didn't invent spirituality. They lived it, through every breath, every fear, every mysterious message written into the wind. If you've come this far in the journey, it means something inside you still remembers. So drop a comment below with the words, "This message was for me," if you felt that echo. If this story stirred something ancient in you, leave a like, and let this video be part of your personal archive of hidden truths. And if you're not subscribed yet, know that this space exists to explore exactly these forgotten pathways between past and soul. So hit that button and stay close. There's another video waiting for you right now, just here to the side. It continues this thread, reaching even further into the secrets time tried to bury. Click and come with me.